This is Pragnia,
This is Jennifer.
and our topic is on political activism, specifically with the question being what are some examples of political activism in history in ways that ordinary citizens and politicians took government into their own hands to create reform? So, our claim is that the political activism around the issue of slavery that sparked during the Age of Reform impacted the US by highlighting issues within the country, which created tension and conflicts between different groups and brought instability. And ultimately, this would lead to the creation of the 13th Amendment.
The 19th century was a period of social and political reform, especially regarding issues of slavery, religion, and women. Slavery was widespread in the US, especially in the South, where slaves were treated as nothing more than property by the slaveholders and was used for harsh labor with very poor treatment. The slave auctions often separated African American families. In the women's rights movement, many women activists supported the emancipation of slaves. Besides slavery, they worked to improve education of children from the working class, promoted gender equality through demanding equal wage and women's suffrage, and finally, they contributed in establishing improved prisons and hospitals for the sick and those who needed mental care. There were two main political parties that dominated the American government in the 1800s, the Whigs and the Democrats. The Whigs, called the Second National Party, emerged in the 1830s, one of the main leaders being Henry Clay. Their ideology was very similar to the Federalists, supporting federal government power, creation of the national bank, and protective tariff. On the other hand, the ideology of Democrats, with Andrew Jackson being the leader, was closer to Jeffersonian republicanism, advocating for states' rights and laissez-faire system. One of the examples for political activism is the abolitionist movement. At the start of the abolitionist movement, African Americans sought to elevate their social status by receiving education, temperance, and hard work. Abolitionist leaders such as David Walker encouraged political protests and revolts to escape from slavery. However, some abolitionists rejected this idea of resorting to violence. People like William Lloyd Garrison sought more peaceful ways of ending slavery, and in 1833, Garrison, Theodore Weld, and others created the American Anti-Slavery Society, which emphasized massive communication and petitions to Congress. The abolitionist movement was faced with opposition and internal conflicts. Almost all whites were opposed to racial mixing and intermarriage between black and white. In response to African revolts, white settlers in Boston outraged and white mobs terrorized black communities. Even among the abolitionists, they themselves argued over gender issues, those who approved of women's active role in the movement versus those who did not. Not only did this movement cause racial conflicts between black and white, it divided the entire nation apart. Slavery also ultimately split up the Whig Party because most Northern Whigs believed in abolishing slavery, while most Southern Whigs wanted to continue the practice of slavery. This is when the Republican Party was formed.
The Free Soil Movement. So, the Free Soil Movement was actually the Free Soil Party, and it was a political party formed in the pre Civil War period. This party was formed by politicians and citizens alike that were opposed to the extension of slavery into the Western territories. And a huge deciding factor in the creation of this movement was the Wilmot Proviso. Originally introduced by Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania in 1846, it called for the prohibition of slavery in the vast southwestern lands that were newly acquired from Mexico. And once this piece of legislation was rejected by Congress, this angered those that opposed slavery further and led them to creating the Free Soil Party. And the party was mainly formed by conscious Whigs who were eventually Whigs that were disappointed with the direction that their party was going, tearing the Whig Party into two. And in New York, they were joined by the Democrats, who were against slavery, also known as the Northern Democrats. So as the rifts between parties grew, the rifts within parties also increased, leading to increased tension within the parties of government and Congress. And as people grew less trusting of each other and started to grow wary of each other, it was harder to pass legislation and law, as nobody could agree. Contrabands. So contrabands is the name given to runaway slaves who were seeking refuge from the Confederacy through the Union and the Union lines in the war. This name was given when the Confederacy demanded that 3 runaway slaves should be returned to them. General Benjamin Butler of the Union refused, saying that since the Confederacy was in revolt of the United States, they would be considered contrabands of war. And therefore, eventually, those who became contrabands of war found refuge within the war camps and often went on to work in businesses, with many becoming laundresses, skilled craftsmen, and other labor workers. In addition to this, many also became a part of the war as a workforce, becoming soldiers, spies, and sailors, helping out in the army any way they could. This would help many to gain lands, such as Roanoke Island, where thousands of free blacks would congregate and start families. However, this created many conflicts because the Confederacy was outraged, since they saw free blacks joining the Union force as them gaining an advantage. In addition to this, many still viewed these free blacks as their slaves and realized that they were not only fighting for the Confederacy to stay intact, but for the institution of slavery too as well.
To conclude, although the abolitionist movement, free soil movement, and contrabands created division in the country and raised conflicts between different groups, they were successful in abolishing slavery in the entire nation. The Union won the Civil War with the help of other political activism parties that formed during the Age of Reform, and the goals of these movements were met successfully, helping to restore unity back to the Union.
And however, this didn't mean that that the states were divided. The South was still very unhappy with the outcome of the war and persisted that slavery be renegotiated. And racism still persisted in American society, even though slavery was technically legally abolished. And this would cause fervor and cause a step for other movements to come, such as the civil rights movement that would come later.